Hello, this is the lecture on the appendicular skeletal muscles, the pelvic girdle, and upper limbs. This lecture is based on Martini's chapter 11. Here are the learning objectives. Here is the drawing assignment: muscles that move the arm, anterior view, muscles that move the arm, posterior view. Here is the list of muscles to learn. The red numbers refer to the arm model that we use in class. Skeletal muscle review. A joint is where two or more bones meet. Muscles can only shorten or contract. Origins are stationary and insertions move usually. A muscle may have more than one action. Each muscle may perform different roles in a movement. There are 4 different roles. Agonist performs most of the action in the movement. It is the prime mover. Antagonist slightly opposes the movement to control it. Synergist helps the agonist perform the action. Fixator, agonist and antagonist contract together to create a fixed space for other muscles to perform other actions. The axial and appendicular skeletal muscles are attached to the axial and appendicular skeleton. Appendicular skeletal muscles move the pectoral girdle and upper limbs and the pelvic girdle and lower limbs. Of interest, superficial muscles are usually relatively large. They cover deeper, smaller muscles. Here is a picture that shows the major superficial skeletal muscles, axial and appendicular, anterior and posterior. So, appendicular skeletal muscles. There are 2 major groups of appendicular muscles. One, muscles that move the pectoral girdle and upper limb. These muscles have a large range of motion. Muscles, and 2, muscles that move the pelvic girdle and lower limbs. These muscles are stronger and have a smaller range of motion than those of the pectoral girdle and upper limb. This lecture covers the muscles that move the pectoral girdle and upper limb. Now, among the muscles that move the pectoral girdle and upper limbs, there are many different actions. One group of muscles positions the pectoral girdle. There are other muscles that move the arm, the forearm and hand, the hand and fingers, an extrinsic group, and the hand and fingers, an intrinsic group. We will learn a lot about the muscles that position the pectoral girdle, move the arm, move the forearm and hand, and just a little bit about the muscles that move the hand and the fingers, the extrinsic and intrinsic group. All right, here's another picture from Martini's: superficial and deep muscles of the trunk and proximal upper limbs, the anterior view, and the next picture shows superficial and deep muscles of the neck, shoulder, and back. It is posterior view. And these pictures from Martini's are encyclopedic. They cover all of the muscles, of which we will cover many, and you can use these pictures as a resource. Okay, appendicular skeletal muscles, muscles that position the pectoral girdle. So I've boxed off here on our list those muscles. The muscles that position the pectoral girdle originate from the axial skeleton and insert on the clavicle and or scapula, which is, of course, the pectoral girdle. They may have origins that are anterior or posterior. So our list of muscles can be broken down into anterior, pectoralis minor and serratus anterior, and posterior, trapezius, levator scapulae, and rhomboid major and minor. So first, the pectoralis minor. This is the first of our anterior muscles. The origin is on the ribs 2 through 5. The insertion is on the scapula, the coracoid process, that little knob of bone anteriorly on the scapula. The action is depression, protraction, and downward rotation of the scapula. And here's a little tiny thumbnail of the different movements. Depression, of course, is pulling the scapula down. Protraction is pulling the scapula forward like you are hugging someone or a tree. And downward rotation of the scapula is the opposite of the upward rotation shown in the little tiny thumbnail at the bottom. If the scapula acts as the origin, then the ribs are the insertion, and the action is elevation of the ribs. So you can imagine that that would change the action. Okay, the next anterior muscle is the serratus anterior. The origin is the ribs, 1 through 10, anterior to sort of lateral placement of the origin. Then the insertion is the scapula, the anterior medial border, and then the action is protraction and upward rotation of the scapula. So take a look at the picture and note the origin, pretty easy to imagine, but now the insertion, you have to imagine the picture that is on the right is taking the scapula and sort of pulling it off the rib cage so that you can see the insertion is on the anterior medial border of the scapula. And then there's a tiny picture of where on the anterior scapula the insertion is found on the far right, little picture of the bone. Understanding that, one can then imagine that the serratus anterior insertion lets one understand that the serratus anterior attaches on the medial border of the scapula, and then the subscapularis, which we will learn, inserts next to it, with the subscapularis ending up superficial to the serratus anterior. So the serratus anterior is deep to the subscapularis. It is right against the rib cage. Okay, and here's a picture of the two anterior muscles that we just discussed, the pectoralis minor and the serratus anterior. Okay, now let's start on our posterior muscles. The trapezius is a large superficial muscle. It has three parts that are called upper, middle, and lower. The upper part of the trapezius has an origin on the occipital bone, the ligamentum nuchae, down to C7, and then inserts on the clavicle, the lateral clavicle. The action is extension of the neck and elevation and upward rotation of the scapula. So again, look at the little picture that shows elevation and upward rotation of the scapula. Then the middle part of the trapezius has an origin on the spinous processes of the vertebra C7 to T3. The insertion is on the scapula, the acromion, and the lateral spine of the scapula. The action is retraction of the scapula to the midline. It pulls the scapula together right between the shoulder blades. And remember, retraction is like standing up in like a military position with your shoulders pulled back, by squeezing the two scapula towards the midline. The lower trapezius has an origin on the spinous processes of T4 to T12 and inserts on the medial spine of the scapula. The action is depression of the scapula. And that, of course, is pulling the scapula downward. The trapezius is superficial to the levator scapula and the rhomboid, which we will discuss next. But you can see that these three parts of the trapezius have very different actions depending on their location on the sides of the neck, all the way down to an origin on T12. So this huge muscle can perform very different actions, ranging from elevation of the scapula to depression of the scapula, with a little bit of retraction of the scapula in between. That's true. Now the levator scapulae. So remember, this is deep to the trapezius muscle. The origin is vertebrae C1 to C4, transverse processes of them. The insertion is on the scapula, the upper medial border, and the action is elevation of the scapula. So I always think that it's the elevator scapulae instead of the levator scapulae to remind me that the action is elevation. Now, the insertion, if you look over here at the picture and you imagine that this scapula is a triangle, it's as though the upper medial corners of the scapula were just trimmed down a little bit, cut it a little slantier, and that's the insertion point. So hopefully that'll help you to remember where the levator scapula inserts. Okay, next we have the rhomboid major and minor. The origin is C7 to T5, the spinous processes. The insertion is the medial border of the scapula. The action is retraction and downward rotation of the scapula. And you can now look at the triangle of the scapula and look at the whole medial border, not the little upper border that's kind of trimmed down and cut off, but the whole medial border, that is the insertion. And these muscles lying between the spinous processes and the medial border, you can see how their contraction would pull the scapula towards each other. Again, like standing in a military posture, throwing your shoulder blades together. These are sometimes called the Christmas tree muscles because they slant from medial to lateral downward like a little Christmas tree. And the smaller branches of a Christmas tree are always on top, and the rhomboid minor is superior to the rhomboid major. So hopefully you can think of the rhomboid muscles as a little Christmas tree and help you remember that the rhomboid minor is superior. And here is a picture showing the three posterior muscles that position the pectoral girdle, and they are the superficial trapezius and the levator scapulae and the rhomboid minor and major. And here's just a table from Martini's that may help you in your studies. Okay.